everyone.
Good evening, Kevin.
It's not a call and response situation, but thank you, Bill. I appreciate that. Thank you, everyone, for joining us here for the Book Club of California's Southern California program titled Riding Like the Wind, The Life of Sanora Babb. We do have another 8 or 9 people who are registered to attend tonight, but we're going to start without them. We're already past the top of the hour, so we're going to get started. Thanks, of course, for joining us here at the beautiful Blinn House, Pasadena Heritage's beautiful Blinn House. We love having our events here, and we're so happy that you could join us here. My name is Kevin Kosick. I'm the Executive Director for the Book Club of California, and it's my pleasure to be here every month for these events. See, someone's coming to the door right now. For those of you that are new to the Book Club of California, we are a nonprofit member and donor-supported organization that is dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes we do that with a focus on the history and the literature of California and the West. The Book Club publishes limited edition, finely made books. We have a scholarly journal called the Quarterly Newsletter, and we have keepsakes for our members. We also host a year-round series of programs and exhibitions like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, California history, and much, much more. Now, if you're not a member of the book club or if your membership has lapsed, almost everyone here is probably a member of the book club, but somebody might watch this on YouTube and go, I'm not a member of the book club. So if you're not a member of the book club or if your membership has lapsed and you're interested in what we do, I urge you to consider joining our century-long tradition by becoming a member. Our membership dues are modest, the benefits are many, and we simply can't do the work of the book club without the support of our members. So I encourage you to go online to bccbooks.org to find out more about the book club, to join, or to donate. And now, on to the program and our speaker. Tonight's program is titled Riding Like the Wind, The Life of Sanora Babb. Our speaker, Iris Jamahl Dunkle, writes and lives in Northern California, but she's here tonight for us. Great pleasure to have us here in person in Southern California. She is the author of 2 biographies, Charmian Kitteridge London, Trailblazer Author Adventurer, and Riding Like the Wind, The Life of Sanora Babb, which is the subject of her talk tonight. Both of these books are available here in the back of the room after tonight's lecture. She's also the author of 4 collections of poetry, including West Fire Archive, published by the Center for Literary Publishing, Interrupted Geographies and Gold Passage by Trio House Press, and There's a Ghost in This Machine of Air by Word Tech. We don't have those books here.
No.
Can only carry so many books, right? We're focusing on the 2 that she has brought with her. Her work has also been published in Tin House, San Francisco Examiner, Fence, Los Angeles Review of Books, Split Rock Review, Taos Poetry Journal, the Chicago Quarterly Review, and many, many others. She earned her MFA in poetry from New York University and her PhD in American Literature from Case Western Reserve University. She was the 2017-2018 Poet Laureate of Sonoma County in California. And now, a little bit about her talk. I don't want to take all your thunder. Quick little paragraph here. In 1939, when John Steinbeck wrote The Grapes of Wrath, when that was published, it became an instant bestseller and a prevailing narrative in the nation's collective imagination of the era. But it also stopped the publication of another important novel, silencing a gifted writer who was more intimately connected to the true experiences of the Dust Bowl migrants. Tonight, our speaker revives the groundbreaking voice of that writer, Sanora Babb. Now, if you have questions for our speaker, please wait till the end. We'll do a little Q&A after the presentation, and you're also going to read a little bit from the book. What a joy that's going to be. So we'll take questions and comments after that is done, and I'll come back up here to do that. So now I'm going to turn the microphone over to our speaker. It's my pleasure to introduce Iris Jamahl Dunkle.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here in this beautiful space. And the last time I read for the book club was in 2021, and it was online. So it's nice to actually get to be here in person. So I want to thank someone in the room, Mary, for being here with me and selling books. I really appreciate it, and for hosting me this evening. It's really important when you write about women who have been forgotten that you remember how their stories got remembered. And in the case of Sanora Babb, it was her very good friend, Joanne Dearcock, who, when I finished writing this book, sent me this coat, which is Sanora Babb's coat.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
She also, so Sanora Babb lived in Los Angeles, in the Hollywood Hills, and over many glasses of wine, they made a promise to one another, or Joanne promised to her that she would keep her friends' books in print, and she did. They're in print to this day, and unfortunately, Joanne Dearcock passed away in April, so she did not get to see this book come into the world and see the wonderful reception it's had. But I am dedicating all of my readings over this year to my friend Joanne, and I'm trying not to cry every time I say that. I'm going to begin by reading you the introduction, which will give you some context into the life of Sanora Babb and why I chose to spend the last 5 years working on this project. And it starts with a quotation from Patti Smith. Do you guys know who Patti Smith is?
Yes. Tell us.
So Patti Smith is a badass rock and roll star, and if I may say that. This past summer, when I was finishing edits on this book, which if you would imagine that the edits on a biography are lengthy. And so I went to a concert with my friend, and Patti Smith was playing, and she got up on the stage and she said, "Use your voice." And I was like, I am going to use your voice in my book, because that is the perfect quotation to start this biography on. So it begins with a quotation from Patti Smith that says, "Use your voice." I knew from a very young age that I wanted to be a writer. But when I was growing up in the 1970s and 80s in rural California, I was rarely assigned women writers to read in class. Having grown up in the West, I've always been drawn to writers who wrote about the West. When I was assigned books by Jack London, John Steinbeck, and Wallace Stegner, I was mesmerized by how they wrote about the land on which I lived. Judging by their depictions of the West, however, and as well as those presented in film and on television, someone like me, a woman, had little to do with the West, and we certainly had never received much acclaim for writing about it. My grandmother grew up in the panhandle of Oklahoma, and she and her family were forced to leave their farm when dust storms destroyed their crops. It was a tough journey, one that would scar my grandmother with its trauma for the rest of her life. My grandmother was proud of her survival, but she didn't want to talk about it, and she most certainly didn't want others to tell her story for her incorrectly. When I was in high school, we were assigned John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. After I read it, I rushed home to tell my grandmother, to tell her, "Grandma, did you know that they wrote a book about us?" She told me Steinbeck got it all wrong. She said he made her and her family look like helpless victims. She said not to mention the book ever again. For a long time, I was confused by my grandmother's reaction. Why was she so upset about this great author's work? How had Steinbeck gotten it wrong? In my schooling up to that point, I had been trained to prioritize the published fictional account written by Steinbeck, a man, over my grandmother's firsthand and of course more accurate real-life experience. I had no idea how right my grandmother's reaction was. When I first stumbled upon and read Sanora Babb's novel, whose names are unknown, written in the late 1930s while she was volunteering at the Farm Security Administration, which built resettlement camps for Dust Bowl refugees, I was overwhelmed with emotion. I found mention of her book while I was watching Ken Burns' award-winning documentary, The Dust Bowl, which features extensive excerpts from Babb's notes and reports and showcases Babb's unique knowledge of the Dust Bowl and its victims. Burns introduces Babb as someone who, like the refugees, had grown up in the affected area around the Oklahoma Panhandle and was deeply committed to establishing a trust and respect with the refugees that extended both ways. Babb's was a story that humanized the experiences of those who had suffered through the worst natural disaster the United States had ever faced. A version where we got to know the characters before the worst days of their lives, when they had had to flee to California to find work, where we saw the lives of women and children through their own eyes, and where we saw Black, Mexican, and Filipino workers in the fields and organizing strikes side by side with the whites. Here was a book that told the version of the Dust Bowl story that aligned with the one my grandmother had told me. Babb was a writer who reported the human truth. As her friend, poet Anne Stanford, wrote about her work, she, quote, represents the truth about life, even in its rough beauty. By the time I finished reading Whose Names Are Unknown, I had become fascinated with Babb and knew that she had to be my next biographical subject. I decided to write my first biography, Charmian Kittredge London, Trailblazer Author Adventurer, about Jack London's wife, an amazing writer who disregarded gender norms, when I found out that she had helped write many of her husband's novels and had never been given credit for it. That biography was used as a source for a remodel of the museum at the Jack London State Historic Park, housed in Charmian's previous home, the House of Happy Walls. Now, when young girls visit that park, they will be introduced to two writers, Jack London and Charmian Kittredge London. This physical representation of my work has motivated me to commit my career to unearthing the stories of women who have been forgotten or misremembered. The more I learn, the more I research, the more I realize how many women have been erased, not only from the history of the West, but from human history. It's an arduous task to tell the story of a life. Babb hated writing biographical statements and was cautious of any biographer who wanted to take on the task of writing a biography of her husband, the Academy Award-winning cinematographer James Wong Howe. Thankfully, Babb left a wide trail of materials, mainly at the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Tulsa at Austin, everything from a pair of beaded moccasins that Chief Black Hawk gave her when she was just 5 years old, living in Red Rock, Oklahoma, to drafts of her novels, to memoirs, poems, and short stories, to the long letters she wrote to and from friends, memoirs, to boxes and boxes of photographs. But while Babb could control what she left as her personal archive, she couldn't control how others would remember her. The word archive comes from the ancient Greek archeion, the house of the ruler. That means that what is placed in or what is left out of the archive is a political act. When you read the biographies of Babb's contemporaries, the novelist Ralph Ellison, William Saroyan, John Fonte, and Carlos Bulosan, whom she supported and who were her literary equals, you rarely see Babb's name mentioned. The omission of her name and of many of her contemporaries' names has had a lasting effect. My research has made me wonder, what would have happened if I had been assigned Babb's whose names were unknown in school, in addition to, or even instead of, The Grapes of Wrath? not only would I have seen my own family's experience within the history I was being taught, but I also would have also been given an example of a foremother, a woman writer who was writing about the West. This biography aims to correct the record by returning to the archives with the intent of writing Sanora Babb's name back into the canon that has forgotten her. The life of Sanora Babb teaches us something about how to better understand the story of the American West. Hers is the story of a strong woman who was not deterred by those who wished to tell her story for her, or by those who would not let her tell her own story. This biography challenges the set canon of the American West by adding Babb's name to that elite and ever-growing list. So, in this biography, Sanora Babb lived an incredible life. She was born in Kansas because her grandmother didn't want her to be born in Indian Territory, but she lived in Red Rock, Oklahoma, and then moved to eastern Colorado, where her family had a broom corn crop, and she lived in a dugout. You guys know what a dugout is? So a hole in the ground, and learned to read off of the pages of the Denver Post that her mother plastered to the wall to cover up the dirt. She spent her time as a journalist in her early years, and then took a train in 1929 to Los Angeles to start her life as a writer. And it was in Los Angeles that she found the John Reed Club, which eventually became the Writers Congress. I can't think of the name of the group that became the Writers Congress, but she joined with this group, and with them became connected to writers like Merida Lasore or Tilly Olson, and she drove cross country with Tilly Olson to New York to the Writers Congress to represent Los Angeles there. But she was really focused on, as the Depression hit and as all of the Dust Bowl refugees were coming to California, she wanted to write her first novel about the people who were suffering, the people from where she was from. And so she went to work for Tom Collins, who ran all the FSA camps up and down California. And I'm going to read you part of the chapter where I reveal the story of how her work was appropriated by Steinbeck. But before I do so, I want to show you something. As I mentioned, I grew up on Steinbeck, and he was one of my favorite authors. So the idea of taking on Steinbeck and revealing things about him that maybe I was afraid to do so took some courage. Also, whenever you write about something that's affected your family, it's hard not to hear your grandmother talking to you, even though she's long dead. So as Kevin mentioned, I'm also a poet, and so when I'm writing a biography, I write in two genres. I'm writing in poetry as a way to process the archival research that I'm doing, and I'm also writing a biography, which is a much more systematic process. And I got on a plane to go to Norman, Oklahoma to give a talk at the University of Oklahoma, and I picked up a copy of The Grapes of Wrath on the way, and I started reading it. And what happened was I started to erase the Grapes of Wrath. So I started to write my own poems inside of the words of John Steinbeck's. And in doing so, erasing and defacing his book. And it became a bit of an art project as the year went along. I've been erasing this for the last 5 years. And it is a book of poems called Endnotes on the West. That's not out yet because I've been busy writing this other biography. But this process of erasure, of writing back, it's actually something I've been doing a lot in workshops with people that want to find power over a document that is holding them back from something. And so I'll pass it around for you guys to look at while I'm talking. But don't spill wine on it.
Okay.
This is Sanora Babb in her early childhood in Red Rock, Oklahoma. This is the dugout. So this is broom corn that's been harvested. And then this is the top of the dugout. So they built like it's a hole in the ground, but with this like top on it. And then this is what she and her sister looked like when they were very young. They starved a great deal. They suffered a great deal, but gave her fortitude for that. That's for sure. So this is from chapter 11. I hope you're thinking of lots of questions.
What does FSA stand for?
Farm Security Association. But you're not supposed to ask them now, Mary. We're supposed to ask them at the end. Just kidding. You can ask them now. Whose names are unknown.
She's using her food.
A few months into her job volunteering for the FSA, the Farm Security Association, Tom Collins invited Babb to a nearby cafe to have lunch with a writer he was collaborating with named John Steinbeck. Steinbeck, who had just published a best-selling novel of Mice and Men in February 1937, had found Collins while he was writing a series of articles on the plight of the Dust Bowl refugees for the San Francisco News, which were published from October 5th to 12th, 1936. Thinking that having a best-selling writer bring attention to the struggling camps would be beneficial, Collins agreed to accompany Steinbeck as he visited the camps. Steinbeck had been so overwhelmed by the first time he accompanied Collins and saw the absolute poverty that the migrants had to suffer. He told Collins, "By God, I can't stand anymore. I'm going away and blow the lid off this place." Steinbeck had again visited Collins for a few days in mid-October 1937. When the writer returned home, he began working on his first attempt at writing his Dust Bowl novel, a manuscript called The Oklahomans. By January 1938, he'd abandoned this manuscript altogether and started his second attempt, L'Affaire Lettisburg. In the second version, begun in February and finished in May 1938, Steinbeck's focus shifted from writing about the refugees to mocking the growers, but by the time he finished it, he was so disheartened by it that he destroyed the manuscript before his agent, who was already marketing the book, had seen it. Collins was thrilled that Steinbeck was writing a novel and hoped he might bring attention to the desperate issues faced by the refugees. As Collins wrote in his own unpublished memoir, Bringing in the Sheaves, he pleaded with Steinbeck to write about what he had witnessed. "What you want to do, John, is to keep your impressions in your mind, and when the time is ripe, do something about those conditions. If you fail to do that, then you are letting those thousands of people down." During Steinbeck's visits, none of the migrants knew they were being observed by a famous writer who intended to document their experiences, as Steinbeck used a fictitious name while he was in the camps. According to Jackson Benson's biography on Steinbeck, the writer hid his identity while he was with Collins because he was afraid of retaliation by the Associated Farmers and other growers' associations. However, Steinbeck did not hide his identity from Babb. It was during Steinbeck's May 1938 visit with Collins, after he had abandoned two versions of the book, that he met Babb. That sunny day, as Babb walked into the cafe, the rainy season had subsided and the earth was throbbing with the possibility of new crops and jobs for the workers. Over cups of coffee, they talked about the camps, the refugees' plight, the terrible control the Associated Farmers held over the communities where they lived, and the powerful political lobby of farm owners. Little did Babb know that the copy of her field notes she would willingly give Steinbeck would not only inspire him as he began his third and final attempt at writing his Dust Bowl novel, but would also make the publishing of her own novel impossible. As she later reflected, Tom Collins had asked me to keep detailed notes of our work every day, of the people, things they said, did, suffered, worked. I thought it was for our work, or for him, but it was for Steinbeck. And Tom asked me to give him my notes. I did. Naive me. Meanwhile, Bennett Cerf at Random House was impressed with the 4 chapters that Babb had sent him, so much so that he invited her to New York to finish writing her novel and offered her a book contract to go with it. The refugees Babb met at the camps were not all poor, uneducated Okies, and the people she introduces us to in the novel are varied and real. She kept the title she had originally chosen, whose names are unknown, which was based on an eviction notice she had seen on a decrepit worker's shack on a corporate farm, a notice that read, "To John Doe and Mary Doe, whose true names are unknown." Babb thought this title embodied the fact that to the big business corporate farmers in California, the migrant workers who toiled for pennies a day were nameless, and to the local citizens who blocked the migrant workers' children from going to school, the children were nameless, and to the hospitals that would not admit migrant women who were suffering difficult births and instead sent these women back to the dirt floors of their tents to deliver their babies on newspapers. These mothers and infants were nameless. In her monumental novel, Babb endeavored to give these people back their names. More importantly, she recorded a version of the Dust Bowl history that gives agency to its victims and highlights the diversity found in California in the 1930s. And this is her book that I will also pass around. It is in print. In Whose Names Are Unknown, we meet Babb's protagonist, Milt Dunn, on the Oklahoma Panhandle. He's living with his father, Conkey, who has decided to switch from growing broom corn to the potentially more lucrative winter wheat, a crop that needs more water than the dry farm broom corn. Babb obtained the background information on farming winter wheat from her father, Walt. The switch would prove to be futile as dust storms began to plague the land where the family was living. In her novel, Babb initiates us into the routine of her characters' daily lives and shows us how intimate they are with the land on which they live. Milt and the old man rose every morning at daybreak. When they came up into the yard, the sharp, high air of western autumn came into their noses, penetrated their clothes, made them go about their chores briskly. Each morning they felt renewed in themselves, and a clear, unknown excitement sprang up in them with a sense of a new season. They looked at the land they had planted the day before, and the land they would plant this day, and they felt a sense of possession growing in them for the piece of the earth that was theirs. As readers, we watch the catastrophe of the Dust Bowl unfold slowly, Babb's characters helpless against what has struck them. She describes what the same land looked like after a horrific night of dust storms. Quote, "All night the dust blew, and by morning the yard wore the melancholy look of a place revisited after years of desertion and ruin." The deeply personal effect of the storms on the Dunn family is depicted toward the end of the first half of the novel through a series of heart-wrenching diary entries from the month of April. Noon, ate on a dirty, dusty table, took up 15 or 20 pounds of dust to make room for more. The dirt is in waves. Think someone's farm is in our house, maybe our own. Babb based these intimate descriptions on ones written to her by her mother in a letter she had sent about the black-blizzard dust storm that hit Garden City, Kansas in 1935. After the dust storms increase, the reader witnesses the devastation that slowly creeps over the town and its surrounding farms like a deadly tide. Farms are lost to the banks. Doctors watch helplessly as patients waste away from starvation. The owner of the general store commits suicide because he's extended too much credit to patrons who cannot pay. Because we have witnessed the human dimension of this ecological disaster in the daily struggles of the people in this small community, by the time Milt and Julia Dunn leave for California with their children, we know they have no other choice. and it is this tragedy that fuels our compassion for them as they are treated as outcasts by both the corporate growers and regular citizens in California. By emphasizing her characters' lives before they were forced to migrate, Babb humanizes them. When Babb set out to write this novel, she did so with the intent to not only depict the truth of what she saw, but also to offer an idea towards a solution. In Babb's mind, the solution had everything to do with the community she witnessed. She believed that the only way for her characters to overcome the horrible circumstances that had befallen them was to band together and fight the giant corporate farms that were overtaking the agricultural industry. Babb's novel ends with the hopeful idea of transformation. Quote, "An old belief fell away like a withered leaf. Their dreams thudded down like the overripe pears they had walked on, too long waiting on the stem. One thing was left, as clear and perfect as a drop of rain, the desperate need to stand together as one man. They would rise and fall, and in their falling, rise again." As scholar Christopher Bowman has pointed out, while both Babb's and Steinbeck's books were motivated by a genuine concern for the Dust Bowl migrants, and both approached their novels as projects with which they could cultivate public support for the migrants in California, the story of Steinbeck's book is quite different. After his two previous starts to the novel in late May 1938, Steinbeck began rapidly writing what would become the iconic book about the Dust Bowl, The Grapes of Wrath. He wrote it fast, completing his first draft by mid-October. As biographer Jackson Benson observed, when at last he did get the writing of the final draft of The Grapes of Wrath, he made it a long sprint rather than a marathon run, and the strain nearly destroyed him. Indeed, Steinbeck would be hospitalized for exhaustion after finishing the first draft of the book. On September 3rd, Steinbeck's wife Carol came up with the title, The Grapes of Wrath, an allusion to Revelations 14:19 through 20, and a verse from the Battle Hymn of the Republic by Julia Ward Howe. Carol Steinbeck would also help her husband by not only typing the drafts as he wrote them, but with writing the revision, that is, correcting errors and editing for contradictions and awkwardness. It's because of her deep involvement in the creation of the book that Steinbeck thought of the book as his wife's novel, and why he also dedicated the book to Carol, who willed this book. He also dedicated it to Tom Collins, who lived it. That was Sonora's boss. Perhaps due to this breakneck speed and his lack of knowledge about the affected area, Steinbeck made serious mistakes and omissions that numerous scholars have thoroughly documented. For example, Steinbeck placed his main characters, the Jodes, who'd been tractored out by their corporate landlords, first in Shawnee and then in Sallisaw, Oklahoma, both of which are far from the Panhandle and outside of the areas deeply affected by the Dust Bowl. According to Benson, Steinbeck did travel to Oklahoma briefly in 1937, making a car trip from Chicago on Route 66 with his wife, but with little intent to do research. Quote, "The Steinbecks purchased a red Chevrolet in New York and started home, stopping by Chicago. They continued their trip following Route 66 through Oklahoma, but according to Carol, John made no conscious effort to do any research for his book along the way. Not only would he not do research on this trip, he would also lie about a second trip. According to Benson, Steinbeck would later encourage a false claim that in February 1938, he, quote, followed a trail of migrants from Oklahoma to California and lived with them in roadside camps when he was researching the book with Tom Collins. But that trip never took place. In addition to this era and setting, Steinbeck's book made it seem as if the only people who were affected by the Dust Bowl were poor white farmers. As Benson points out, the family Steinbeck was writing about was actually a composite of several families he had encountered in visiting one squatter's camp after another. Steinbeck had only met the people he based his characters on briefly, and this distance shows in his characterization of them. We see little of their interior dialogue, and most of them remain stereotypes. Steinbeck's novel doesn't linger for very long in Oklahoma. When the story begins, the disaster has already occurred. The Jodes have lost their land. Therefore, his character's relationship to the land is never established. Nor does his novel elaborate on the horrific effect the greatest semi-natural disaster in the United States had on the people who were living in no man's land. Instead, his story focuses on what happened after a handful of the 650,000 Dust Bowl refugees left their homes and everything they knew and arrived in California. Because of this, Grapes of Wrath readers don't witness the slow terror of the natural disaster as it affected people in their homes in Oklahoma and Colorado and surrounding states, and how it left them with little choice but to flee or starve. For source material, Grapes of Wrath, Steinbeck would heavily rely on the FSA notes written by Collins and Babb. Steinbeck noted using, quote, great gobs of information from Babb's and Collins' reports and notes, and from Collins' subsequent letters. As he recorded in the journal he kept while writing the book, quote, letter from Tom with vital information to be used later. He is good. I need this stuff. It is exact and just the thing that will be used against me if I get it wrong. Steinbeck was, quote, particularly worried about a conspiracy designed to discredit him by the Associated Farmers or other growers' associations. Babb continued to work at the camps until late October or November, when she returned home to work on her book and reunite with her sister and James Wong Howe. But she soon realized that to finish her book, she needed the time and space to write. So the following spring, she took the train to New York to finish her manuscript while living on the Upper West Side with her friend, the dancer, Lotta Goslar. She loved living in New York City and knowing her first book was nearing completion. The early summer was boiling hot, but she sat at her desk and diligently completed editing her book and turned it in to Bennett Cerf, her editor at Random House. Cerf wrote to Babb on July 27, 1939 to say the first reader's report on Whose Names Are Unknown had come back, quote, exceptionally fine, and told her that he wanted to, quote, read it myself. He promised to get it back to Babb within a week. However, a week later, when Cerf invited her to the Random House offices to meet with him, she faced a situation she could have never expected. When she entered his office, he was seated formally at his desk, which was cleared of everything except a check under his hands. She knew right away that something had gone wrong. Though the reading reports about her book had been extremely positive, Cerf explained to Babb that her publishing contract for Whose Names Are Unknown had been canceled due to the wide success of Steinbeck's new book, The Grapes of Wrath. By June 1939, The Grapes of Wrath had sold over 200,000 copies, and film rights to the book had been sold for $75,000. Steinbeck's fame, which had already been solidified by his best-selling 1937 novel Of Mice and Men, was skyrocketing. Babb was speechless and left Cerf's office in utter and complete shock. The two readers' reports about Babb's book had the same complaints that, quote, it would almost seem as if Sanora Babb and John Steinbeck had thoroughly discussed an identical theme and set out to write their separate books. So similar are The Grapes of Wrath and Whose Names Are Unknown. They go on to explain Babb's approach. The plight of these people is described with great understanding that indicates personal experience. Whereas Grapes had color, excitement, and humor, Babb's book is more uniformly intense, more a piece of the drabness of her people. What's heartbreaking is how this reviewer closes the report. If there hadn't been a Grapes, I would say unreservedly, here is something new, something fine, we must publish. Moreover, an unusual talent is displayed in this first novel. In subsequent letters, Cerf, who acknowledged the craft of Babb's novel, but couldn't see his way to publishing two books about the same event, advised Babb to put her manuscript away for a few years until the market might be more receptive to another novel about the Dust Bowl, as he wrote in a letter on August 16, 1939. After viewing the matter from every angle and discussing it in a full editorial conference for an hour, I don't see how in God's green earth we can publish Whose Names Are Unknown. What rotten luck for you that The Grapes of Wrath should have come out before your book was submitted. but also should have swept the country. Obviously, another book at this time about exactly the same subject would be a sad anticlimax. And I think that you must face the fact, just as we did here, the last third of your book is so completely like The Grapes of Wrath that the families and characters might basically be interchanged in the two. Before she left New York to return to Los Angeles, Babb pleaded with Cerf, but nothing she said changed his mind. When she said she'd have her agent shop her manuscript around to other publishers, he explained that she was welcome to do so, but he knew their answer would be the same as his. Sadly, Cerf was right. Babb sent her manuscript to all the main publishing houses that fall and winter, and each rejection letter echoed sentiments similar to Cerf's. Her writing was good, but because of the success of The Grapes of Wrath and the uncertain times of a possible world war, the publishers couldn't take a risk on Babb's first novel. Babb was devastated. As she recalled, quote, "I thought after that blow I couldn't ever write again, and I didn't for a year." As Babb would later recall, "I worked in the fields for months with Tom Collins, to whom The Grapes of Wrath is dedicated, who asked me to make detailed nightly notes, and we passed on this great bundle to John Steinbeck, who came down to the fields 2 weekends and then wrote that fine book. He had some sense to stay home and write. He was already a professional, and I was young, vulnerable, sympathetic, with those courageous families and innocent of publishing ways. Cerf did not let Babb leave New York empty-handed. However, instead, he sent her home with a $250 advance and a contract for a new novel. Babb, still in shock about what had happened, left without signing the contract. She couldn't fathom the idea of walking away from a book she had spent years writing and starting over to write a brand new novel. Babb didn't give up on her novel without a fight, though. Even after Bennett Cerf and so many other New York publishers had rejected her work, Babb continued to seek support for her work. When she wrote her Guggenheim application in late 1939, she asserted the difference between her book and Steinbeck's. In Whose Names Are Unknown, I presented the people in a somewhat different light than in The Grapes of Wrath, and I feel I know these people thoroughly and want readers to know them in this way. At a time when so much of the American West is plagued with natural disasters and climate migrants are a growing worldwide concern, Babb's novel and her extraordinary life offer us a lesson in humility. Had Babb left the FSA camps and finished her novel just a few months earlier, perhaps it would be her Dust Bowl novel, in addition to The Grapes of Wrath, that would be taught in high schools across the country, and perhaps our understanding of that period in history would have been widened to include more than a single story. So this is Sanora Babb in 1938-39 on the left, and that's the last fancy photo that was taken of her. She was a little bit older in 2004 when Whose Names Are Unknown was published, thanks to Joanne Deercott, the woman who was her literary executor. And I just want to say before I end that I do a weekly blog on Substack because I can only write so many biographies in my lifetime. And so I write one every week about a new woman that has been forgotten or misremembered. It's called Finding Lost Voices. And there's a little QR code. If you take a picture of it with your phone, it'll sign you up for free. Everyone you can become a paid member, but you can get free material. And one thing that I'm doing this month is I am doing a guided reading to Whose Names Are Unknown. So if you're interested in reading that book that I've been passing around and I just told you about, if you become a paid subscriber, then you do get weekly emails with detailed background information about the chapters. So since you all seem to be readers, I think you might be interested. Thank you guys so much. I hope you have lots of questions.
I'll stand over here. You
Okay.
can. What do you do?
He's taking a picture of the QR code.
No.
Please.
For everyone but Gloria. Let's take some questions right there.
How many books did she write, is the first question, and how long did Steinbeck spent researching into camps in California?
So I'll start with the second half of your question. Steinbeck spent 2 weekends at the camps.
2 weekends.
2 weekends, yes.
Okay.
But he did other, he was involved before, in 1936, he did some research with Tom Collins. So they were in correspondence, and he did that series of articles in San Francisco. So he was involved with the plight of the Dust Bowl migrants, but the people he was writing the Graves of Wrath about were not like based on real people. It was just kind of the essence of the people, is what he called it. Sanora Babb would go on to write her first published novel, The Lost Traveler, was published in 1958, and she published An Owl on Every Post, which is a memoir. It's a stunning memoir about her time in eastern Colorado, growing up in that dugout. And that was published in 1970. And then she's published poems. She was very well known as a poet when she was younger, and short stories. In everywhere from 17 magazine to Saturday Evening Post. She was in a writing group with Ray Bradbury for 40 years, and he thought she was the best writer he'd ever met. She also wrote, there's also, Whose Names Are Unknown came out in 2004, and now there's lots more books available thanks to Joanne. So you can get collections of her stories and her poems. They're all available on Amazon if you want to find them.
Thank you.
Yeah, other questions? Yes.
I know this is might be a strange question, but can you tell me something about the derivation of her name?
Sanora, yeah, that's a popular question actually. Her mother just liked the sound of it, and that's why. Her mother was very musical, and so she made choices based on how something sounded. She actually had a piano in that dugout, and would play it until it got so wet that the keys wouldn't play anymore. But she was a wonderful musician.
So what was the sister's name?
Dorothy.
Oh.
Dorothy Babb. Yeah, not as
lovely.
Not as lovely. Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the family?
Yeah. About her early life.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they traveled around a lot. So her father was a gambler, and he ran a bakery in Red Rock, and he was pretty abusive to her and her mother. And so she would escape at a very young age. So Red Rock is right on the corner of the Otoe, Missouri nation. And so it was a very porous boundary. So everyone lived together in Red Rock. And in fact, her father ran a baseball team, the first indigenous white mixed baseball team, semi-pro baseball team. And she would escape to the Otoe people and spend weeks at a time there. And she got her name, Cheyenne, riding like the wind, from Chief Blackhawk when he gave her this pony as a present. And she got on it, and then this gun went off, and it just shot, like just took off, and she was like holding on for dear life. And he gave her that name as laughingly afterwards, because she was riding like the wind, whether she liked it or not. But Cheyenne was the name that her father gave her. So that's where the title comes from, riding like the wind. It's from Chief Blackhawk's name for her. But they moved to prove up land in eastern Oklahoma. Her grandfather was proving up, but her father instead sold the bakery and bought a piece of land outright in eastern Colorado, which is not a really easy place to farm. There's really no water. And it almost, they almost starved to death because of it. But then they ended up moving to Elkhart, and then, which is in the corner of Kansas. And then they moved to Forgan, Oklahoma, where she went to high school. Then they moved to Garden City in the middle of Kansas, and that's where she had her dad flip a coin to tell her to become a writer if she was going to go to New York or go to LA, and it landed on LA. So she ended up coming here in 1929, and I think you know what happened in 1929. Great economy. So she struggled a lot here, but she worked for the Warner Brothers radio station, and she ended up becoming homeless for 6 months, living in Lafayette Park on a bench with a group of other people. She ended up writing freelance all over, and she wrote a screenplay at some point, as I guess everyone does in LA. I'm just kidding, but all of that happened before, you know, she ended up having this adventure. And, you know, she also, after this, was blacklisted and lived in exile in Mexico City for 1.5 years. And that was a big part of why her story was also forgotten. She was trying to avoid being called to testify because James Wong Howe is her husband, and he was being scrutinized, and he wasn't going to be able to work as a cinematographer. And he was pretty well accomplished at that point, hadn't yet gotten his Academy Awards. He got 2 Academy Awards. But because of that, she went and lived in exile for 1.5 years in Mexico. Yes?
How did she come to work for this Farm Security Administration?
So she and James Wong Howe lived in London for 1 year. And while they were there, she went on a trip around the Soviet Union. She was brought about the whole area by interest, which interest was the people that controlled your experience in Russia. So you only saw in Soviet Union, so you only saw what you're supposed to see, not the Stalin version of Russia. And so she was in what is now Ukraine, and she saw all the model farms, and she saw that as such a great solution to the people starving back in Kansas, that, you know, her mother would write her these letters, like, when a black blizzard would come and be like, she went and visited and saw it. And so she thought, well, this could be it, you know, what if we all banded together and had these model farms? And so she was really interested in getting to know the people who were affected by this. So when she came back to LA, she started working on her novel and realized that she needed to not only write articles, because she was writing articles for the New Masses and other outlets. She was writing reportage, you know, these really intense, wonderful feature stories. And she realized, I need to be in the field and work there. So she, through another screenwriter friend, she discovered how to get in touch with Tom Collins, and he offered her a job. And so that's how she got hooked up with him. And she spent 9 months recruiting refugees all over the state to come to the camps, and then actually like running all of the systems. They were democratically run camps. The idea was that when people came to the camps, they were empowered to get back on their feet, right? It wasn't like they just gave them handouts, because all of these people would not take that. They were people that didn't believe in that. And so to help them, they set up this system of a democratically functioning camp, is what Tom Collins called it. And they had like a newsletter, they ran their own childcare, the whole system was set up and run by the people. It was pretty amazing. So that's how she kind of got pulled into the camps just to do research. But then she was, you know, as everything that happened in Sonora's life was like that. Like she'd get pulled into a project and she'd be so immersed in it, right? That she would almost forget that she was doing research for her book and just, you know, want to be there with these people, because she really identified with them.
Don't give away everything in the book. You're going to just stand here and tell all the stories of the book.
Yeah, sit down, I'll just tell you the whole book.
So with that question and that answer, we're going to wrap up for this evening.
Great.
Join me in thanking our speaker.
Thank
you, Iris Jamahl Dunkle, for this great conversation this evening. And thank you all for attending this book club program. We actually have a very exciting book club program next week. We have 2 happening in Southern California this month. Next week, Wednesday, November 20th at 5:30, we are going to have a Southern California launch of the book club's 243rd finally made publication titled From California, poems by Dana Gioia, engravings by Richard Wagner. Again, it's our 243rd book that the book club is publishing. The event is not going to be here. It's going to be with our wonderful partners at Archetype Press at Art Center South Campus here in Pasadena. Again, 5:30 a week from tonight. We are going to actually be doing a broadside, a keepsake printing at that event. The book will be available at that event. It's going to be super fun. So please join us a week from tonight if you're available. You can register for that program and any program that the book club is doing online at bccbooks.org/programs. You can email me, Kevin, at bccbooks.org. You can call us, you can go to our website, you can click the link in the emails that you're probably getting from the book club. If you're not getting those emails, you should be getting those emails. So sign up for those emails about all of our programs. And if you're interested in the book, this book, or Iris's other book, we still have copies of that in the back. She is signing copies. You can purchase one in the back. Thanks everyone for joining us. Hopefully we'll see you next week. If not, we'll see you next month.
Thank you, Kevin.
Have a great night.
Thank you.